projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, a podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 5, 3 on a Matinee. My guest and I will be taking you back to the late 30s, when the Saturday afternoon screens came alive with a trio that paved the way for other hero teams to follow in the decades to come. Of course, I'm talking about none other than
the Three Mesquiteers.
So what?
Stick around and you'll find out.
And your names, gentlemen?
Just call us the Three Mesquiteers.
Mesquiteers?
What do you do, a song and dance or a dumb act? You know, sis. They're like the Three Musketeers I read about. One for all and all for one.
Yeah, all for one.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening in. As the youngster just explained, the three heroes on horseback that we'll be discussing today are called Mesquiteers, as in the plant and Texas town Mesquite, as opposed to the Musketeers of Alexandre Dumas. Between 1936 and 1943, Republic Studios cranked out 51 movies featuring the trio, although, like Marvel's Avengers of today, the characters and casting did some shifting around. Joining me to chat about the Three Mesquiteers, I'm very happy to have prolific author and film historian Michael R. Pitts, who has written or co-written movie reference books on a wide variety of topics. Michael, welcome to Movie Nights and Matinees.
Glad to be with you.
Gosh, where to start? There's so much material here. I first learned about the Three Mesquiteers a number of years ago when I was compiling filmographies for what I had hoped would be a book, an encyclopedia of movie series. I saw some of the films then, just a handful, but it's always kind of intrigued me, just this many movies in such a short span of time. We're used to things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or even James Bond, which have an impressive number of movies, but not in such a short time span. The running times of the films was generally a little under an hour, so to some extent you could compare it to an hour-long TV series. While 51 episodes wouldn't seem like much of a feat spread out over 7 years for a TV show, 7-year run for a series is pretty good in itself. And when you consider that TV shows would produce less content in an hour because of commercial breaks, and then you factor in all the location shooting, stunt work, and animal wrangling, it's fairly amazing that they were able to be so productive in that time span. First of all, let's talk about you and kind of your background, just in general as an author, and how you came to love movies and start writing about them, and then how the Westerns particularly captured your attention and interest.
I grew up in central Indiana and on a farm in a rural area. And so about the only entertainment was television. So I became addicted to watching movies on television. And I was very fortunate that one of the local TV stations had a program hosted by Frances Farmer, who was a very famous film star in the 30s and 40s. And she was on for 6 years. And between her and the other stations that showed all kinds of vintage films, I became addicted to movies. And that's how it all started.
I think I read, even though you've written on a variety of genres, you are especially fond of Westerns.
Westerns are probably my second favorite. Vintage horror films are my favorites.
Oh, really?
And that's what first addicted me when the Screen Gems package was issued in 1957, 58. I became addicted to those old, the classic horror films. But the Westerns also, and of course, Westerns were very popular on television when I was growing up as TV series. And so there wasn't really any window between the two Western old movies and Western series. So I saw a lot of both of them. So B-Westerns over the years has also become a big favorite of mine.
Yeah, there's that term. And I think for the younger listeners, who I hope we have a good number of, can you Give us a little thumbnail definition of when we say B movies, B westerns. What are we referring to there?
We're referring to lower budget than the A productions. A B movie does not necessarily mean bad movie. It means lower budget. And in some cases you can tell it, in some cases you can't. So like the Three Mesquiteers, those films were so slickly made that you can't tell that they were low budget films. But the budget is where the B comes in.
And I guess the telltale thing there would just be the running time, because B movies do tend to be, as a rule, pretty short compared to the A pictures, right?
Usually, that is another factor. Although a number of A films back in the 30s and into the 40s sometimes didn't run much longer than the B movies.
That is very true. Yeah, the one that immediately comes to mind, the first interview I did for the podcast was with Joe Adamson, and we talked about the Marx Brothers, and I mentioned that after all the editing, Duck Soup ended up being just a little over an hour. So that was an example of what you're talking about right there.
And that also made room for double features, which were very popular in the 30s and 40s and into the 50s, where you have an A picture on top and a B movie supporting it. And again, the running time, the two combined would give you about maybe 3 hours in the cinema, along with maybe a serial chapter, a newsreel, and so forth.
Yes, and of course the trailers too. So when did you start writing about movies?
In the late 60s, I had my first magazine pieces published, I think, in 1969, and my first book, The Great Spy Pictures, which I co-wrote with James Robert Parrish, came out in 1974.
Yes, and you collaborated with him on a number of books, right?
Oh, yes. We worked together on, well over a dozen books. And I still like to collaborate again, but he's retired, so.
I see. About how many books have you written over the years?
My latest book just came out. It's called Nick Lucas, The Singing Troubadour and His Guitar, biography of singer-guitarist Nick Lucas. It's my 47th book.
Wow, that's quite the resume. So tell us a little bit about that one. I'm not really familiar with Nick Lucas.
Nick Lucas was one of the biggest record sellers of the mid-1920s into the 30s in popular music. But today, a lot of people remember him for introducing the six-string guitar into popular music.
Really?
Before he came along, the guitar was sort of a passé instrument, and he introduced it into the bands and onto records, and he was the first to have the guitar instruction books, a line of guitar picks, but he always considered himself a singer more than a guitarist. But he was both, and his work influenced many guitarists, especially in country music.
Now, would we know any of his work from the movies?
He didn't make a lot of movies. He did two of the first all-talking musicals that Hollywood produced. Warner Brothers did The Gold Diggers of Broadway and The Show of Shows. Later on, he did quite a series of short films. And then in the 70s, he did voice tracks like on The Great Gatsby and Day of the Locust, Hearts of the West.
All right. Well, that's a new one to keep an eye out for then. So turning a little more toward the topic du jour here. Now, you had told me when we spoke before that you are not only interested in the Western films, but also you've read a lot of the Western source material.
Well, I have for the Three Mesquiteers. I'm not particularly a great fan of Western novels. I read some occasionally. One of my favorite short stories is The Caballero's Way by O. Henry, which introduced the Cisco Kid. But overall, I don't read too much, but I do read William Colt MacDonald, and he is the man who created the Three Mesquiteers. He was one of the most popular Western writers of the last century.
Yeah, and it's interesting especially given this series, with so many movies having been made based on his work, there doesn't seem to be a lot of information out there on him. I certainly didn't have luck finding very much. What can you tell us about him?
Well, he was born in 1891, died in 1968. He was, I think, from Michigan originally, and started out working at various jobs, and ended up one of the kind of sidelights he had was writing for pulp magazines, and that's where he got interested in Westerns. And according to his son, he really enjoyed researching. his works. And then about 1929, about the time the Depression started, he decided to go on his own, and that was successful for the rest of his life, writing Western novels, with one exception. I have one book by him that was done in 1964, 4 years before he died, called The Glove Saskia, which is a mystery. And it's the only one of his books that I've ever found that's not Western.
Well, that's a nice bit of information about the author. It occurred to me that, if we were doing movies that were based on works of Zane Grey or Max Brand or Louis L'Amour or something like that, we probably wouldn't have any trouble, finding out the biographical information. But man, William Colton McDonald, I came up with zip. There just doesn't seem to be that much information out there to be found.
No, there isn't. The best biography I found of him was actually a foreword to one of his books called The Red Raider, and it was written by the late John Tuska, who was a film historian and also a Western historian. And he had researched his life, and that's where I got a lot of the information about him. But we should note that William Colt McDonald's books are still in print,
really?
Some of them, and especially large print editions. And so he still has a reading public.
Well, speaking of books, before we leave that topic in the trail dust, I should mention that you've written a couple of books that are very relevant to the discussion we're having here today. There's, first of all, Western film series of the sound era, and you've got a chapter in there on the Three Mesquiteers. And then also you got one called just Western Movies, which is kind of an understated title because it's like an encyclopedia of what seems like about every Western movie ever made.
Well, I try to get what is available. If it's available or has been available on film or tape or so forth. Yeah, both of those books are in print and published by McFarland and Company, and you can find them. Also, James Robert Parrish and I did two books, The Great Western Pictures, Volumes 1 and 2, years ago, and those are available again now on ebook. And the Mesquiteers are included in some of them too. So,
okay, so a lot of good sources for information, people who want to dig into it a little more after they finish listening to the podcast. Don't go away yet. Of course, after we are done here, just pay a visit to the Movie Nights and Matinees website and go specifically to the bookshelf page, and there you'll see Michael's books that we've been talking about, and you can click on the links there to order them, to add to your library, and each order that you place like that will be a little bit of financial help to the podcast, so I'd really appreciate it if you would do that, and I know Michael would too. So now, you said that you had read the Three Mesquiteers books, so I guess we want to talk a little bit about the origins and early evolution of the characters that would form the basis for the series. And please correct me if any of my research turns out to be incorrect. The characters, at least, well, there are three Mesquiteers. There are three characters there: Tucson Smith, Stony Brook, and Lullaby Joslin. Now, from what I have found, apparently Tucson and Stony first appeared in a 1929 novel called Restless Guns. And what I read indicated that in that they were referred to as the Inseparables and the Ramblin' Hombres.
Yeah, John Tuska confirms that in his biography information. Yeah. And then Lullaby came along later. I don't know the name of the novel he was introduced in, and then it became the Three Mesquiteers.
Yeah, what I read, the first of the novels, the Three Mesquiteers novels, was Law of the 45s, and so then I guess that's where Lullaby was introduced.
I think that's correct. Yes.
Okay, and that was almost the first Three Mesquiteers movie to be made. There were a couple before Republic launched the series. That's primarily what we're talking about. There were actually three movies that utilized the characters to one degree or another. Actually, the first one was 1935's Powder Smoke Range, which had Harry Carey as Tucson Smith, then Hoot Gibson as Stony, and then Gwen Big Boy Williams as Lullaby. And that was a big deal, too, because it actually had a couple of future Mesquiteers in it in supporting roles, Bob Steele and Tom Tyler.
Who were themselves big Western stars at the time. And that film was as billed as an all-star Western because there were so many stars in that, men who had starred in Westerns. You know, Art Mix, William Desmond, William Farnham, and quite a few others.
Yeah, and that was from RKO, and it just seems like they kind of missed the boat in terms of doing anything else with those characters. Although it would have been a real oddity for them to do that, because although they had a number of film series in the 30s, 40s, whatever, they didn't have any Western series, I don't believe.
They only had one that was with Tom Keene, and then later on in the 40s they had Tim Holt, but they didn't adapt any of McDonald's. And the reason for that may be at around the same time, Columbia Pictures had optioned a number of McDonald's stories and filmed them starring Tim McCoy.
Oh, that's right. That preceded the Three Mesquiteers series. Yeah, I saw that there were some Tim McCoy movies that have been. Now, were they adapted from his stories, did you say, as opposed to him actually writing the stories for?
No, they were adapted from his stories, yes.
Okay, all right.
From the pulp stories that he had written in the 20s.
And then, gosh, practically the next week, it seems, after Powder Smoke Range, then there was another picture, a different studio, I think it was Grand National, did Law of the 45s, adapting the first Three Mesquiteers novel.
We stationed several men there, but no further raids have occurred.
And I thought it might be a good idea if I purchased Mrs. Porter's ranch and placed several of our men there.
That's a waste of time. What about the law?
They're doing all they can.
Then why not resort to the other law?
What law?
The law of the 45.
But they only used two of the Mesquiteers for some reason, and they changed the name a little bit. They had Gwen Big Boy Williams, who had played Lullaby in Powder Smoke Range. Now he was playing Tucson Smith, and they had Al St. John with him as Stony Martin rather than Stony Brook. That seems a little bit odd. And there was no Lullaby in there at all. And Al St. John in Westerns, that was a concept I had to kind of wrap my mind around, because I originally was familiar with him from the old silent movie days as Roscoe Arbuckle's nephew and one of the members of his filmmaking company, appearing in films with Arbuckle and Buster Keaton. And previously to that, they'd been Keystone Cops together, that sort of thing. So when I started seeing that he had become famous for these Western roles, these Western sidekick roles for the most part, I thought, wow, that's really unusual. But in this one, where he's playing Stony Martin, he's not quite as, I guess you'd say, rough around the edges as what he become more famous for as his fuzzy sidekick character later on.
Yeah, it was a more straight acting part rather than comedy.
Yeah. And then there was a third film, and this one seems a real oddity, and I don't know who the studio was on this one. I didn't get that in my notes, but a film called Too Much Beef, which starred Rex Bell, although apparently all he does, he uses Tucson Smith as a cover identity in kind of a mystery kind of thing. So I guess maybe that was just considered sort of a shout out to the, or a little homage to the Three Mesquiteers without actually trying to be that character.
I have no idea. You kind of suspect maybe that, the Alexander brothers, Max and Arthur, produced both Law of the 45s and Too Much Beef. They were nephews of Carl Laemmle of Universal. And I have a feeling maybe they might have just paid William Colt McDonald a little money to be able to use the character's name. That would be my guess, because it doesn't seem to be based on too much of anything else. But Powder Smoke Range, now, going back to that one, that is a very slick and well-made film. That is almost an A movie. And in some places, it played as an A movie. And it's from a very, very good novel. Of all the McDonald books I've read, and I've read quite a few, I would have to say Powder Smoke Range would be my favorite.
Okay.
Very well written. Very well done.
All right. And then in 1936, 1936 brings us the movie actually called The Three Mesquiteers. And McDonald did write a novel called that, right?
He did later, but I don't think this film was based on his novel.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. So in any case, that establishes the Republic series. Although one of the things that is noteworthy about the series is the variation that went through the whole series, both in terms of casting, settings, the times in which they were set. It's really odd in that regard. And it starts right off the bat because you had Robert Livingston playing Stony Brook, and you had Ray Corrigan playing Tucson Smith, and you had Sid Saylor playing Lullaby Joslyn. But that was the only film that Sid Saylor appeared in the whole series. He would be replaced as of the second film, Ghost Town Gold, by Max Terhune.
Saylor didn't, according to the exhibitors, said that he just didn't gel with the other two very well. And he didn't. Sid Saylor was a fine character actor, especially in small parts, but he just didn't work out as well as Max Terhune did. And of course, Max Terhune was a ventriloquist, and
Right.
he introduced he never called him a dummy. He was his ventriloquist doll, Elmer Sneezewood, and he interpolated him. And of course, he was very good with comedy and underplayed comedy, and it fit in very well with the series with the other two actors, and became quite was very, very popular with audiences.
Yeah, the character of Lullaby does seem intended to add a lighter tone to the group than what you get with the other two, who are essentially the strong leading man types. At least that's how it was in the series. In Powder Smoke Range, that wasn't so evident. Anyhow, the exact manner in which Lullaby would embody that varied between the actors who played him during the run of the series. Sid Saylor was more the semi-bungling fish-out-of-water character, whereas Max Terhune seemed fully at ease in the Western setting, and he brought a folksy humor to the role, in addition to Elmer, who was, I guess you'd say, the fourth Mesquiteer.
Cut the comedy or I'll let you have it. Now, where's the rest of your outfit?
Shall we tell them?
Well, what do you think?
I don't know. Reckon it's proper?
Maybe not.
They wouldn't understand anyway. They're too dumb.
Yeah, but on the other hand, what have we got to lose?
That's right. I reckon we're better.
Well, you tell him, Tucson.
The rest of our outfit is on the pack horse.
I tell you, Max Terhune was so popular, he told me that a Republic executive told him that he was from Indiana, from the area where I'm living, and he said that at least 15 cities in Indiana at that time claimed Max Terhune. That's how popular he was.
Wow. Yeah, well, he was certainly one of the more prolific members of the Mesquiteers over the run of the series. And as I mentioned, that Ghost Town Gold was his first in the series, and that's where you do see him acquire Elmer at a 3-card Monte booth at a carnival. He's the prize that he wins. And so it's a little interesting. It's like, okay, because he immediately starts using the ventriloquism, and you didn't have any basis for knowing that he'd be able to do that. But he gets Elmer in his hands, and suddenly he has this ability.
His success as a ventriloquist in these films paved the way for Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy to make films. Before that, studio executives didn't think ventriloquists would be successful on film.
Huh.
But Max Terhune's success in The Mesquiteers brought Edgar Bergen to the screen.
Well, and in addition to the ventriloquism, Max Terhune established Lullaby as someone who could do animal noises.
He ain't doing that right. Well, it ought to goes like this.
He catches on quick, don't he?
Yeah. But between you and that canary, give me the bird.
With pleasure. Elmer, remember your manners. Well, he asked for it.
To what extent do the ways in which the characters were played on screen, and I know that's going to vary from actor to actor, but to what extent does that track with the way they were portrayed in the novels?
From what novels I have read of the Three Mesquiteers, they're pretty much, they fit pretty well, but at the same time, those actors kind of brought their own personalities to the role also. And so they kind of blended together pretty well. I would imagine William Colt MacDonald was pleased with the way that his characters were represented on the screen, and especially in the early Republic.
Yeah, and as far as I've been able to tell, there's only about 4 or 5 that were actually adapted from the novels. And one of them is kind of a question mark to me, because Hit the Saddle, which I think was the 5th, indicates that it was, in the credits, that it was based on a novel, but then it has an original story by than another writer's name. So I'm a little, and there's no William Colt McDonald novel by that title. So that one puzzled me a little bit.
The only three that I have come across that seem to have been from the books were Ghost Town Gold, Roar and Lead, and the Riders of the Whistling Skull.
Yeah, I've got those.
Those three were definitely based on McDonald's work. But after that, I think basically Republic paid McDonald for the use of his characters, and they had their own in-house screenwriters concoct the.
Yeah, and that's pretty much
story.
Reflected in the credits too. Oh, one thing I wanted to ask too, in that first Republic picture, the introduction of Lullaby Jocelyn, the story revolves around some World War I vets. It's set in 1919, and Sid Saylor is among them as Lullaby. And in this one, it's indicated that Lullaby is actually an Easterner who aspires to be a Westerner. Now, does that track with the character's background in the novels?
That I don't really remember. The novels I've read, he's well integrated with the other two, and that's a very good possibility. It sounds logical, but I can't really I can't confirm or deny that one.
Listen, fellas, if you let me go with you, I'll try awful hard to be useful. Come on, partner. I'm a Westerner. Yippee!
Well, in any case, at the end of that first one, he does join up with them, and then certainly in the person of Max Terhune in Ghost Town Gold, the next picture, he seems certainly at ease and a fully integrated member of the group. And Bob Livingston, he had previously appeared in the serial The Vigilantes Are Coming, and he actually played Zorro in The Bold Caballero. So he had some interesting pre-Mesquiteers credits.
His most interesting pre-Mesquiteers credit is Frankenstein, because at the end of they had to reshoot the end of the movie to make a happy ending, and there's a long shot of an injured Dr. Frankenstein in bed being watched over by Mae Clark. Well, that isn't Colin Clive, who originally played Frankenstein. It's Robert Livingston.
Really?
Under the bandages, yes.
Wow. I mean, I have to think that maybe somewhere once upon a time I read that, but I sure didn't remember it. And that's interesting to hear or learn or be reminded of.
See, maybe we should mention that they why they were called Mesquiteers.
That's what I think. Funny, because I was looking at my notes. That's the next question I need to ask. It's they get referred to here and there, although I don't think they're referred to by that at all in the first Republic film, but in the second one, Ghost Town Gold, they do get referred to as the Three Mesquiteers by one of the villains.
What a wallop. I'll bet you he could whip the champ.
Who is he?
I don't know, but the names on the check he was playing for was Tucson Smith, Stony Brook, and Lullaby Jocelyn.
Oh, the Three Mesquiteers.
But when do they acquire that name? What's it based on?
Well, I think what it is to take off on Alexander Dumas' the Three Musketeers.
Right.
And of course, mesquite is a plant indigenous to the West. And if you combine the two, you come up with Mesquiteers rather than Musketeers. I think that was a kind of William Colt McDonald having a little bit of fun with wordplay there. But that's probably the origin.
Sure. I was just wondering if within the context of the stories, if there was any sort of explanation as to how that name got applied to them, such as, maybe they're from or based in Mesquite, Texas, which is not far from where I live. In fact, there are actually a couple of references to Mesquite, Texas in the movies, so maybe.
You know who they are? They're the Three Mesquiteers. I seen them last year in Mesquite. Big fella with a special sheriff. Boy, they sure cleaned up that inn.
Now, of the characters, was Tucson Smith regarded as the leader? It kind of seems that way in a lot of them, and in Powder Smoke Range, getting back to before the Republic series, certainly Harry Carey is the more senior member of the group, and is very forceful and authoritative. It seems like Tucson is the leader.
Now get this, Ogden. The boy is clear with the law. I'm vouching for him. As to the Tresborough killing, well, I've got my own ideas about that, too.
Am I to understand that you don't want to be friends?
That's up to you. I'm not looking for trouble, if it can be avoided. But on the other hand, me and my pals are prepared to burn plenty of powder if anyone interferes with us. Is that clear?
Well, in the series, they were pretty equal, especially Tucson and Stoney. But when Republic came along, it was Stoney that kind of took the lead.
Well, one reason I think Tucson often comes off as being the leader is that a recurring theme is that Stoney is kind of the ladies' man of the trio, which a lot of time is used just for humor, but on occasion sets up some real conflict between the characters.
Tucson, you're going too far. I like Rita, and I want you to show her the respect she's entitled to.
I've pulled you out of dozens of these puppy romances before, Stoney. Don't slip your halter now. But you see, she's not your type of girl.
That's enough. You can save your mother goose rhymes for lullaby. I'm asking you to keep out of it.
All right, Stoney. That's the way you feel about it?
And, of course, that's very evident later when John Wayne did the 8 films in the series.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, because even with John Wayne in there continuing some of the ladies' man aspect of the character, he definitely comes across as more forceful.
Motion granted. Case dismissed.
Just a minute. What kind of a farce do you call this?
Don't you approve of the way we conduct court?
This isn't a court, it's a 3-ring circus.
Careful, young man.
Of what? You're sworn to uphold the laws of this territory, and what do? Jump like a rabbit every time he cracks a whip.
One more word from you and I'll fine you for contempt of this court.
Words fail to express my contempt for this court. As far as you're concerned, you're a fine running mate for his honor. You both ought to be behind the bars.
Now, let's see. We talked about Bob Livingston and some of his earlier credits. Now, Ray Corrigan, he had starred in the serial Undersea Kingdom.
He was basically, and I don't know what you would, there's a word for it, and I don't recall what it is, but he was a health expert, physical fitness. He was kind of an early Jack LaLanne, if that makes any sense.
Okay, well,
and that's how he got into movies. But he also had another sideline in the movies. He wore a gorilla suit. He owned a gorilla suit, and he would bill himself as Naba, and he would rent that suit out with him in it to various studios. And you see him in some of the Tarzan movies and other films. And he also played Naba in one of the Mesquiteers, the Three Texas Steers, where there's a circus background.
Yeah, I remember having read that. I guess he was kind of the Rick Baker of his time.
You could call him that. Yeah, he kept that suit until the 50s. He finally sold it to Steve Culbert. And but for about 20 years or so, he made a second living with that suit. And of course, later he went on to set up Corriganville, which became a famous location shooting for westerns. So Ray Corrigan had all kinds of sidelines.
Right. And I guess that trio, the Bob Livingston, Ray Corrigan, Master Hune, I think that trio was the most prolific in terms of the number of pictures they did together as the Mesquiteers, aren't they? Didn't they rack up the most?
Yeah, they did about 15 or so. And and then of course John Wayne came along for 8 and Bob Steele and Tom Tyler later on. But they were probably they did the most together.
And during their run, they had one variant in there, the Trigger Trio, when evidently Bob Livingston had been injured, so he had to sit that one out. So they brought in Ralph Byrd, who had already debuted in the character he would eventually become completely associated with, Dick Tracy. He had completed the first Republic serial as that character. So they brought him in as Tucson's brother Larry for that one picture.
I thought when Stoney pulled out from Mexico, we'd have a little peace around here. That kid brother of mine would have to show up and spoil it all.
You know, Tucson, it was kind of lonesome around the old ranch after Stoney left. And, well, your kid brother has livened things up a bit.
Yeah.
Come to think of it, he's a lot like Stoney.
Yeah, that's just what's got me worried, Lullaby. I hate to think what'll happen when Stoney gets back and the two of them pair up.
Livingston was actually injured twice in the series. When The first Mesquiteers film had to be delayed because he suffered an injury.
Now, I had read that he and Ray Corrigan didn't really get along very well. Is that true? Do you have any knowledge of that or insight as to why?
The story is that Ray Corrigan and almost everybody didn't get along. Baxter Hune told me that he was probably Ray Corrigan's only friend. Apparently, he was pretty difficult. Now, I've heard another side of the story. One time in the 70s, my wife and I took a trip to Knott's Berry Farm, and on the way back, I struck up a conversation with a bus driver who told me he was a young man. When he was a young man, he and his buddies used to go out to Corriganville, and he thought the world of Ray Corrigan. He said he was a wonderful person. So, but I've heard other people say that he was difficult. So,
okay.
But yeah, there was animosity between Livingston and Corrigan. Yes. Later on, when Corrigan made the Rangebusters with Max Terhune and John King, he and John King didn't get along either.
So then after 16 pictures, we get the next major cast change, and that's when Bob Livingston is replaced by John Wayne as Stony Brook, beginning with Pals of the Saddle. Now, do you know what the basis of that, why it was recast at that point?
Yes, the public felt that Robert Livingston was more suited for non-Western roles, and they put him in a lot of action pictures and that type of thing. And then in the 40s, they even teamed him with an actress whose name I forget right now, in romantic films. And they did The Cheaters, a big A picture that they were in the supporting cast of that as a team. They were teamed up. So Republic kept trying to make a big star out of Livingston, and unfortunately, it never quite worked out. Although he was always good in whatever film he was in. And then John Wayne had been working at Universal. He had come off making a whole bunch of films for producer Paul Malvern at Monogram and then at Universal. And he signed with Republic to do these Mesquiteers, which is pretty much of a step down for him. And then during the production of his 8 films, John Ford tapped him for Stagecoach. And of course, that was it. After Stagecoach, he did nothing but A pictures.
Yeah, finished out the contract and then never looked back.
Exactly. Although he had great fondness for Republic, and he would always come back and make pictures for the studio until it closed up in the 50s, late 50s.
Though, as you say, his return to Republic would be within A pictures. He was done with the Bs. And during his stint as a Mesquiteer, there were certainly some interesting guest star appearances within the films. For instance, Overland Stage Raiders is notable for being the final film of actress Louise Brooks.
Yes, I read an essay she wrote about that, and she said that film was one of the great joys of her career. She said she met 2 of the nicest men she'd ever known. One was a giant named John Wayne, and one was a little cherub named George Sherman, who was the director of the film.
I think it's time you and I had some serious conversation.
That's no lie.
Why, you said that like you had the weight of the world on your shoulder.
Maybe I have. Stoney, it's something I've got to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago.
She said they were 2 of the nicest people she ever worked with.
And another notable guest appearance in the next to last film that John Wayne did in the series, Wyoming Outlaw, that featured Don Red Barry, as he would come to be known, who would shortly thereafter appear as the screen's first Red Ryder in the Republic serial, a few years before Bill Elliott would star in the series of Red Ryder films for Republic.
Yeah, that film actually launched him as a Western star. He had been a supporting player for several years, and his performance in that was so dynamic.
Well, this is a fine way to treat a couple of friendly strangers.
Friendly? How do I know you're friendly?
You'll have to take our word for it.
Don't give me that. I'll take the wind's word that it's going to rain, and I'll take the sun's word that it's going to be clear. But I've learned never to take a man's word for anything.
But you don't mind taking a man's steer without asking him, do you?
When you're hungry, you ain't thinking. But you're not going to lock me up. I'll kill anybody that tries to lock me up.
You better soft pedal on that killing stuff, Bub. If you make good on it, they'll hang you.
Hang me? They'll have to catch me first.
Now, if you compare that film with the later High Sierra, which came out a couple of years later,
with Bogart,
they're very much alike. with Bogart. He's got the Bogart role, or Bogart's maybe got his role, but they're very much alike, the two films. Of course, Wyoming Outlaws on a much smaller scale. Also, speaking of actresses, Carol Landis, who became a very popular actress, was a leading lady in one of the John Wayne Three Musketeers also.
Yeah, I saw that she did a couple of them.
She was in a serial or two, but she may have made another one in the series. I don't know. Max Terhune told me of all of the actresses that he worked with in that series, his favorite was Rita Hayworth.
Oh, yeah, that's going back to Hit the Saddle again, yeah.
Yes.
Under her original name.
Rita Cancino. He said she was the nicest, really the nicest. He said a lot of them are very nice, but he really liked Rita Hayworth.
I see that Jennifer Jones, and now is it the Jennifer Jones that we're talking about? That would have been
yes,
New
Phyllis.
Frontier.
She used her real name, Phyllis Isley. Yes, that was Jennifer Jones. Yeah, so a number of future stars were leading ladies in those Musketeer films.
Yeah, further on down, I see Gail Storm in one of them. Wyoming Outlaw actually also represented the first one without Max Terhune, and he was replaced by Raymond Hatton as Rusty Joslin.
What happened there was Corrigan had set up a deal. He had set up Corriganville, and he had set up a deal to film. He was co-producer on what's called the Rangebusters series for Monogram, and Max joined that, I presume, because he got more money. But their contracts didn't end at the same time. Max's contract ended first, and then Corrigan's ended within a few months. So that's why they left the series, because they went over to Monogram to make the Rangebusters.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so Corrigan did 2 more pictures as a Musketeer before leaving. And the thing that was interesting, too, is I thought, okay, I'm going to make it a point to watch Wyoming Outlaw and see how they introduce the character of Rusty Joslin, but they really don't. He's just there, and they never.
Yeah, he shows up.
Yeah, they never explain. I mean, it's like, why even bother giving him the last name Joslin if you're not going to tie him into Lullaby in some way? I mean, the presumption would be he's Lullaby's brother, his cousin, something along those lines, but we're never told. And his character is very different than that of Lullaby. It's a little more in keeping with the kind of sidekick character that Gabby Hayes and Al St. John were known for doing. Although in that first picture, he's pretty clean shaven and pretty folksy.
How's the scenery, Rusty? Magnificent. You can see the Rocky Mountains. That's them going by.
It's only later that he becomes a little scruffier and looks a little bit more like those other characters.
No, that was one of the things. Of course, he stayed with the series after John Wayne left. He stayed with the series when they reunited. They brought Bob Livingston back to replace John Wayne.
Right.
And Hatton stayed with the series, and then they brought in Duncan Rinaldo, the future Cisco Kid, to play Rico.
Yeah, that was the Kansas Terrors, and that's one I have not been able to get my hands on, because that sounds like a really interesting storyline that they had there where they introduce his character, but I have not been able to see that one. I assume that you've seen it. Can you kind of give us a synopsis of how that plays out?
I just remember the character being a part of the series, but I don't. I wrote my chapter on the Musketeers for the book Western Film Series of the Sound Era many years ago, and haven't gone back and looked at those. So I don't really remember just how he came, but he was introduced. I remember that part of it. It wasn't like with Rusty Joslin; he just didn't show up. There's a plot ploy in there.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, a synopsis I read, Stoney and Rusty visit a Caribbean island for some reason and end up helping Rico liberate his people from a dictator or something like that. So I suppose out of immense gratitude, he signs on as the missing third Musketeer for a few films.
That makes sense. As I say, I don't remember it. And of course, that trio didn't last too long because Bob Steele joined them in 1940.
Yeah, it looks like that particular trio did about 7 pictures, and then Duncan Rinaldo, Raymond Hatton, they leave, and Bob Livingston stays on as Stoney, but then Bob Steele comes in as Tucson Smith, returning to the trio. And then we get a new Lullaby Joslyn alongside him, played by Ruth Davis, who most people probably, well, certainly people of my generation, mainly remember him as one of the two engineers on the Cannonball locomotive on the TV show Petticoat Junction.
Along with Smiley Burnett, who, of course, was Gene Autry's sidekick.
Yeah, exactly. And Ruth Davis's version of Lullaby is visually a little more reminiscent of Max Terhune, but the way he plays it is kind of a hybrid between the humor of Max Terhune and a little bit of the fish out of water aspect of Sid Saylor, because he doesn't seem as adept at the heroic good guy stuff as the other two characters, but he certainly plays his part. And he also does occasional animal noises, as Max Terhune did, although he never attempts any ventriloquism. So that trio, Bob Livingston, Bob Steele, and Ruth Davis, they did 7 pictures together, ending with Gangs of Sonora, and then Bob Livingston leaves the series for good and is replaced by Tom Tyler, who plays Stoney for the rest of the series, beginning with the film Outlaws of Cherokee Trail. And as mentioned earlier, he had appeared in Powder Smoke Range as a villain who becomes reformed by the end of the picture. And also that same year, he starred in the Republic serial The Adventures of Captain Marvel, known to the younger generation of today as Shazam. But, of course, back then, before the DC Fawcett lawsuit, he was Captain Marvel, and Shazam was just the word that he used to become Captain Marvel.
He's also in I think it's the Night Riders with John Wayne. He's a pure villain in that one.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember seeing that he was in that one. I have not had a chance to watch that one yet, though.
Yeah, he was one of the bad guys in that one.
And then later he'd star in another serial based on a character from the comics, The Phantom, the Jungle Hero. And I believe that was just pretty much right after the end of the Three Mesquiteers series.
Yes, he was in the early 40s. And he played Karius the Mummy in 1940 in
That's right.
The Mummy's Hand.
The Mummy's Hand, yes. That was another one. I want to get your thoughts on the lack of continuity in the series in terms of the time frames in which the action takes place. As mentioned before, that first film is set in 1919, and by the time you get to Overland Stage Raiders, you're seeing contemporary vehicles. In that film, the plot actually revolves around first a bus and then an airplane. Sometime after that, though, one of the films, I forget which, seems to be set not long after some legislation from 1902, with Under Texas Skies, when Bob Steele comes in as Tucson Smith and Ruth Davis is the new Lullaby. There's a full-on reboot. It's set in 1858, and we learn that Stoney and Tucson were friends as youths, but have gone their separate ways. Their reunion in the picture is a little rough, considering that Tucson gets framed for the murder of Stoney's father. And then Lullaby moseys into town as a traveling peddler, and we find out that he's an old friend of Stoney's. Still later, the time frame jumps forward again, and they tackle Nazis in at least a couple of the films near the end of the series. Do you have any particular insights or thoughts on all that discontinuity?
No, that's one of the mysteries of the series. Is the only thing I can think of, maybe it dealt with what sets were going to be available, what the storylines were, just a variety. And also, we these things were not issued back to back. I mean, sometimes months went by before you got a new one. They put out about 8 a year, but sometimes there was longer intervals between the release, and then sometimes they'd come out back to back. So it's people going to theaters and didn't think too much about continuity, I don't think, in those series.
Well, I think it's safe to say, too, that the movies were probably made with their audience in mind, which I guess was largely going to be the kids at Saturday matinees and so forth. And, they were probably not going to be all that concerned about continuity from one picture to the next.
Exactly, yeah. They were interested in the storyline and making sure the hero only shot 6 bullets out of his gun. If it counted 7, people did that. They checked that kind of thing. And so they were more interested in that than they were continuity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the main thing is the movies are generally well-paced and a lot of fun. you'll find a number of Western cliches scattered about, like the good guys wearing white hats, shooting the gun out of the hands of bad guys from a distance instead of killing them, walking into a saloon ordering sarsaparilla instead of red-eye. Oh, and getting back to kind of the issue of continuity for a minute, there's another recurring element in there, what's referred to as the 3M Ranch, which is evidently their base of operations. But I haven't seen any film that indicates how they happen to set it up. They do become owners of a ranch in Powder Smoke Range as a main plot point, but in the Republic films I've seen, the 3M mostly just gets mentioned from time to time. And I think Valley of Hunted Men, one of the later films, is the only one, at least the only one I recall, where it's actually shown. Some of the action actually takes place at the 3M Ranch.
Well, I think the reason for that was probably it was like their headquarters. Like in the Hopalong Cassidy series, the Bar 20 was Hoppy's headquarters. That's where he, and then you branch out from there and have your adventure. So I have a feeling that's what that was all about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Although another puzzling aspect is that I have no idea where the 3M is supposed to be located. As you mentioned, in terms of branching out for their adventures, the adventures of the Mesquiteers seem to take place all over the West. Some titles specify locations, such as Heart of the Rockies, Santa Fe Stampede, Riders of the Black Hills, Three Texas Steers, and the one we've already mentioned, Wyoming Outlaw.
Or California, you never know.
Yeah. Looking over the titles, I'm kind of surprised there isn't one, called Burbank Roundup or something like that. And, of course, the 3M Ranch would later become famous for inventing Scotchgard, designed to keep livestock from staining during the long cattle drives. Okay. Getting back to more pertinent aspects of the series, the final cast change came in 1942 with Shadows on the Sage, where we got a new lullaby played by Jimmy Dodd, who was probably remembered more as a Mouseketeer than a Mesquiteer, thanks to his role on the Mickey Mouse Club, where he would play his guitar that had its own set of mouse ears.
Yeah, he was most associated with Disney. He worked in other films, but I would say he was probably the weakest of the lullabies.
Well, he did bring kind of a different spin to the character and the type of humor that you normally associated with Lullaby up to that point in the series. His version of Lullaby tended to be youthfully naive, though at times he displays a well-timed cleverness.
Gimme, come on.
Not for that kind of a bet.
Oh, come on, Tucson.
Oh, no. Try the other side of the street.
Stoney, how about it? I'll guarantee the investment.
We'll guarantee you.
You mean to say I'm not worth $5?
He does get to sing a little, at least in the final film of the series, Riders of the Rio Grande. The three of them are in jail, which seems to happen a lot. That's one of the recurring things that happens over the course of the series, is that one or more of the Mesquiteers gets either framed or mistaken for somebody else, and they end up in the clink. And in this case, while they're cooling their heels in a cell, Lullaby, in the person of Jimmy Dodd, does get his hands on a guitar and starts singing a song about them being in jail. There was one other frequent player in the films that we should probably mention, and that was famed stuntman Yakima Canutt. I think he generally plays a member of the bad guys gang, but he would obviously have been relied upon to perform some of the more elaborate stunts involving horses, stagecoaches, and such. Are there any stunts in the series that you recall as being particularly impressive?
When I think of the Mesquiteers, I really don't. You really more think of him more with his earlier John Wayne films that he did at Monogram and so forth. The Republic films, and not just the Mesquiteers, but about everything they did, the Westerns, their serials, they were so slickly done. And there were other stunt people, too, like Dave Sharp and Tom Steele and so forth. So I'm sure Canutt worked on some of those, but pull out one specifically, I can't do it. I could do it earlier with his Monogram films with John Wayne, but not with the Mesquiteers.
All right, fair enough. Okay, oddball question of the day. If you could do any mixing and matching from among the various cast members, and characters for that matter, is there one that you would piece together that would be the optimal set of Three Mesquiteers, or is there an existing one from those that were in the films that you think just stands head and shoulders above the rest?
The ultimate set.
Yeah.
Actually, the ones that I find the most satisfying, I like Livingston, but the John Wayne, Crash Corrigan, Max Terhune. I think those three were the best. And believe me, I'm a big fan of Bob Steele and a big fan of Tom Tyler. Both of them were great, but not as Mesquiteers. Their films were okay, but if I had to pick the ones I liked the best, it'd be John Wayne, Ray Corrigan, and Max Terhune. But the thing about the Mesquiteers is, they launched about a half a dozen other series of trio heroes. And of course, we talked about the Range Busters.
Yeah.
But there were others too, In fact, Bob Steele was in one of them, the Trailblazers series with Ken Maynard and Hoot Gibson for Monogram.
Yeah, it seems like Monogram scooped up several former Mesquiteers. As you said, the Range Busters got Ray Corrigan and Max Terhune, and then the Trailblazers that you just mentioned, which actually started out as a duo, and then Hoot Gibson was in that through the run, and then Bob Steele came along to make it a trio. And then they also had a group called the Rough Riders, which had Buck Jones, Tim McCoy, and Raymond Hatton. Now, among all the films, is there one that just really stands out in your mind as your absolute favorite?
I would probably say Overland Stage Raiders.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, apart from having a little more of an unusual plot, you've got John Wayne in there being John Wayne, and he just in the role definitely seems more dynamic than the other characters. So for anyone just now becoming familiar with the series and that are interested in watching some of the films, to give them kind of a good overview, which of the movies, and I assume Overland Stage Raiders would certainly be on the list, which ones would you most recommend that they check out?
Well, on par with that is the Santa Fe Stampede. And the silent film star William Farnham gives an excellent performance in that. And another one, which is also on par, would be the Riders of the Whistling Skull, which is based on MacDonald's novel. And that is practically a horror film.
Are you able to translate the writing, Miss Marsh?
Whoever shall seek to defile the sacred city shall cry for death and find it not.
There's a scene in there where an Indian mummy actually comes back to life. It's a very well-made movie.
Sheriff, the curse on this knife handle shows plainly that it's a clear-cut case of Indian vengeance.
I disagree with you, Stoney. The murderer may be unknown, but he's still in this room. The door was closed, and there don't happen to be any windows.
So I'd say those three would be at least my favorites.
And Santa Fe Stampede, that was another one with John Wayne.
Yes, it was.
Along with Ray Corrigan and Max Terhune. And one other interesting element of Riders of the Whistling Skull is that one of the supporting characters is played by Chief Thundercloud, who would later on play Tonto to Bob Livingston's Lone Ranger in the second Republic Lone Ranger serial, The Lone Ranger Rides Again.
But he also ended up in a couple of films with the Trailblazers with Bob Steele and Hoot Gibson. He was one of the three heroes in that.
Well, okay. It's a small cinematic world, I guess you could say. Well, I think that has given us a really good overview of the Three Mesquiteers series, one which I can personally recommend. I've been watching them, especially lately, and really enjoying them. So if you enjoy Westerns at all, if you particularly enjoy the B-Westerns, or if you're a John Wayne fan and maybe these have flown under your radar, then definitely check them out. They're readily available, a lot of them, through various streaming services, although the quality is going to vary. So I'm a big fan of physical media for that reason, in part. Not that that's always a guarantee of getting a really good print of something, but the main thing I like about it is I don't have to worry about the internet going down. We've got our library here, so if I feel like watching something, just pull it off the shelf, pop it in, and I'm off and running. So definitely check them out. And you can visit the Movie Nights and Matinees website, the screening room page, and you'll find links to mostly physical copies of a lot of these films. the ones that are available. Now, there are also some links for streaming, although those are not apparently available everywhere. So you may or may not be somewhere where you can access them. But most of them are available on physical media in one manner or another. So, Michael, pardon me for taking a little bit of time there to, plug the website and so forth. But now I'll come to the question that I always ask my guests at this point, and that is, what is your most memorable movie-going experience? Doesn't have to be Three Mesquiteers. It doesn't have to be Western. Just in general, your most memorable experience going to the movies.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I lived in the country, so I didn't get to go to movies very much. But the film that sticks out in my mind, the one I enjoyed the most, would have been around 1960, The Time Machine, with Rod Taylor, based on H.G. Wells' novel. Mm-hmm. I wrote that stays in my mind more than I think any other theatrical film I've seen.
Well, I can certainly see that. That was a very memorable film. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Rod Taylor once a number of years ago when I was working in a video store, and I was probably a little more starstruck meeting him than a number of other celebrities and performers that I have met over the years. And with that, Michael, I want to thank you for your time. It's been fun chatting about this series. I hope a lot of people have found it interesting and will, as a result, check out some of these movies, because they really are very entertaining and a fun way to spend an hour or so. Now, I'm going to be talking with you again soon about one of your other books, and I'm still doing my homework on that. I'm enjoying it, and I'm looking forward to having a chance to talk about that one. Not going to reveal which one yet. I'm going to save that for a little bit later, but I think people are going to find that interesting as well.
Well, thank you. I look forward to it.
Not only am I grateful to Michael for joining me here on Movie Nights and Matinees, I also want to thank you. That's right, you, over there. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate everyone who's listened and subscribed to or followed, as the case may be, depending upon the button where you listen to it. And please visit the Movie Nights and Matinees website, visit the Movie Nights and Matinees Facebook page, and somewhere leave a comment, a rating, wherever you listen to it, just because that kind of feedback is really important, and I'm craving it. I need that validation. Okay, maybe that's overstating it a little bit, but anyway, it'll be useful to get that kind of feedback, to know that, I'm doing things right here. I want to make sure that you're enjoying what I'm doing, and leave any suggestions, for topics or different ways of doing things, whatever strikes your fancy. So now it's time for me to saddle up and mosey on out of here and get ready for the next episode. But first, let's check the weather.
The sun is shining, but the ice is slippery.